Hey everyone, thanks for tuning in. If you're new here, consider subscribing. It really helps keep these stories coming. And while you're here, let me know in the comments where you're listening from. Now sit back, relax, and let's get into the story. The sirens didn't sound when it began. There was no warning, no emergency alert, no red banner scrolling across the bottom of the screen. Just a low-pressure front, a stretch of grey sky, and a rain that wouldn't stop. We'd been through storms before, even floods, but this one was different. I remember thinking that clearly on the third day of rain, when the water began to creep up the street, submerging curbs and washing branches down the sidewalks. My name is Nick Halperin. I'm a civil engineer with the Louisiana Department of Transportation and Development, out of the District 08 office near Alexandria. My specialty was structural inspection, particularly old bridges and retaining systems. It was supposed to be a safe, stable job, not exciting, but practical. I never imagined it would end with me wading through knee-deep water in a half-submerged town, hiding from things that used to be people. It started just south of us in the lowland basin, where the Calcasieu River meanders past the outskirts of a small place called Burton. The area had been saturated for weeks, and the dam north of Lake Charles was already at capacity. We were told to monitor, not intervene. Natural retention, they called it, part of the state's new philosophy on watershed management. The night the levee broke, I was staying in DeRidder, about 20 miles north. I'd rented a room above an old hardware store while we assessed rural bridge spans that had buckled under erosion. The power had gone out earlier that day again, but I had a portable generator and a stack of MREs I'd picked up from the last National Guard depot in Oakdale. What I didn't have was communication. Cell towers had been overwhelmed, and the satellite uplink at the DOTD trailer had gone dark with the last lightning strike. I didn't hear about what happened in Burton until I drove down the next morning. Not from a report, not from my team, but from what I saw with my own eyes. The road into town was washed out at the main fork. Highway 27 looked more like a canal than asphalt. I parked the truck on a rise just outside the waterline and hiked in. My boots were submerged almost instantly. I remember passing the wreck of a school bus partially submerged and listing against a telephone pole. It hadn't crashed, it had floated there. And that's where I saw my first one. It was a man, or had been. Pale skin, bloated from water, in torn jeans and a blue flannel shirt soaked black. He wasn't walking, more like limping, dragging his foot like it didn't belong to him. His face was turned away at first, but when he saw me, he made a sound that didn't belong to anything I'd heard from a human throat. Not a growl, not a scream, something between the two. And then he rushed, not staggered, rushed. I backed away instinctively and slipped on the wet slope, dropping my field tablet into the water. He lunged where I'd just been, splashing wildly, reaching with outstretched arms. That close, I saw his eyes milky, fogged over like glass, and his mouth lined with blackish red, as though he'd been chewing through raw meat. I ran. I didn't look back until I reached the old grain elevator that overlooked the edge of town. The place had been abandoned for decades, but the upper levels were dry. I climbed inside through a service ladder and stayed there, quiet, heart hammering in my chest, trying to understand what I'd just seen. That wasn't a flood victim. That was something else. By nightfall, the town was submerged up to the first story of most buildings. The old train station was a lake. I counted at least a dozen more of them. People who moved wrong, sounded wrong, attacked animals in the streets or each other. I kept my distance, watching through a pair of Leica field binoculars I'd salvaged from my truck before the water rose. At one point, I saw someone firing a weapon, a hunting rifle, maybe a Remington 700 from a rooftop near what used to be the library. They were shooting at the things. I saw at least 3 of them go down before the shooter vanished behind the chimney. The next morning, I made my way across the rooftops to get a better look. There were walkways between buildings, some made of plywood, some of sheet metal. It reminded me of stories I'd read about Katrina people building ad hoc escape routes above the waterline. That's how I met Clara Dubois. She was holed up in the old Masonic Hall, a brick 2-story building that had once hosted town meetings, bingo nights, and holiday potlucks. Now it was barricaded with plywood and furniture. I knocked carefully on the boarded-up side window, and she answered with a pump-action shotgun leveled at my chest. "I'm not one of them," I said immediately, hands raised. "I'm from DOTD. I was inspecting bridges." She narrowed her eyes, then finally motioned me in. "Get in and stay low." Inside, the place was fortified like a war bunker. Furniture was stacked high against the doors, and blackout curtains hung over every window. Clara looked about mid-30s, wiry build, red hair pulled into a ponytail. She had the no-nonsense demeanor of someone who'd been surviving alone too long. She introduced herself between checking the barricades. "I'm a nurse, or was. Lake Charles Memorial Hospital. We got overflow evacuees from Burton. One of them, something wasn't right. First he got violent, then others got sick. They pulled me off shift and locked the floor. I left the next day." She'd returned to Burton to find her uncle, only to discover the town had already begun to drown and change. "It's not just sickness," she said quietly as we lit a camp stove. "It spreads through bites. I saw it. You get scratched or bitten, you change in hours, sometimes faster." We compared notes, shared rations, and decided to stay the night under cover. There was no use trying to wade out in the dark, not with the water rising and the infected now lurking in deeper numbers. The sound of helicopters woke us at dawn. A pair of UH-60 Blackhawks circled high above, followed by a smaller Bell 407 configured for medevac. They didn't land, they didn't drop supplies, they just circled and left. "That's the second time they've done that," Clara muttered. No response, no radio, nothing. We tried our emergency band radio again, tuning to 121.5 MHz international emergency. Still nothing. "They know," she said. "They're watching, but they're not coming." That day, we tried for higher ground. A local high school sat on a ridge just north of town, DeRoche High, and if we could reach the gymnasium roof, we'd have a line of sight to the levee breach. Clara still had a kayak lashed to the roof of her uncle's hardware store. We retrieved it carefully, moving rooftop to rooftop using rope lines and makeshift pulleys. Getting there took most of the afternoon. The kayak could only carry one at a time with gear, so I ferried Clara first while she scanned the water with a hunting scope. Then we returned for supplies. By evening, we reached the gym, and that's when we saw the full extent of it. The town wasn't just flooded, it was quarantined. Every road in was blocked by concrete barriers and abandoned vehicles. No personnel, no rescue operations. The waterline had cut off Burton entirely, and any survivors left had either gone quiet or joined the others. "We need to get this out," I said. "We need to show someone." Clara nodded, retrieving a waterproof drone case from her stash. "I've got a Mavic 3 thermal. If we can get it high enough, we can record everything, the breach, the movement, the infected. Then maybe someone will take us seriously." That night, we launched the drone from the rooftop. It flew north over the broken levee, capturing thermal images of movement patterns, water flow, and clusters of heat signatures in places where there shouldn't have been any. At least one school had become a nest. Dozens of bodies moving erratically inside the flooded auditorium. By midnight, the drone returned. We backed up the data. Clara copied it twice, one on a rugged SD card, the other to a solar-powered SSD she kept on her vest. But something had followed the drone back. We heard it moving in the water below a soft slosh, then the creak of metal as something climbed onto the lower level of the gym. The shotgun came out. Clara motioned me back. From the broken emergency stairwell it appeared. It had once been a woman, black hair matted with debris, one arm bent backward at the elbow, legs raw from abrasion. She didn't hesitate. She screamed a horrible gurgling wail and sprinted straight at us. Clara fired once, sent a mass, it stumbled, then kept coming. She fired again this time, into the head. It dropped. We stared at it for a long time, waiting, but it didn't move again. "They don't stop unless it's the brain," she whispered, "just like the others." The storm picked up again that night. Rain hammered the rooftop, and for the first time since I arrived in Burton, I realized this wasn't just a flood. This was a containment zone, a forgotten town left to drown and to rot. The sound of wind howling through the ruptured gym windows mixed with the dull roar of the water below, rising again inch by inch. We stayed on the top floor, using emergency space blankets to mask our heat signatures and dim red flashlights to conserve power. The drone footage played on a small solar-charged tablet in Clara's lap, flickering with stuttering thermal frames hotspots moving erratically through submerged corridors, classrooms filled with twitching clusters, corpses that didn't quite stay still. "This is proof," she said. "They'll see this and realize what they've done. This is enough to trigger a federal response." I wanted to believe her, I really did, but if a dozen flyovers hadn't brought help already, I doubted another handful of grainy images would change anything. I didn't say it aloud. She needed that hope more than I did. The rain tapered off before dawn, but the water stayed high. We rationed food carefully, a few foil-packed MREs, water from collected runoff, plus iodine tablets Clara had stashed in her kit. The plan was simple. Move before noon, reach the municipal building at the heart of Burton, and try to access the repeater tower on its roof. If that failed, we'd head east toward the old waterworks, where the service tunnels might lead out of town below the floodline. We used the kayak again, paddling carefully between half-drowned vehicles and utility poles. The smell was getting worse, a mix of algae, sewage, and something else. Something foul and meaty that hung in the back of your throat. We didn't speak much as we moved. Talking drew sound, and sound meant attention. At one point we passed the submerged post office. The upper windows were shattered. A dark shape leaned against the frame, unmoving. I almost dismissed it as another corpse until it twitched and turned its head slowly toward us. Its eyes didn't blink. It watched us, neck turning unnaturally as we passed. It didn't scream. It didn't charge. It just watched, and that was somehow worse. The municipal building was built in the 1970s, a concrete cube with few windows and a reinforced steel door at the rear marked "Authorized Personnel Only." We broke in with a pry bar, inching the swollen frame open with gritted teeth and quiet strain. Inside, the air was heavy with mildew. Filing cabinets had floated and rusted shut. The main stairwell was blocked with collapsed ceiling tiles. But the elevator shaft still offered a vertical route. Clara rigged a makeshift harness using climbing webbing and pulley clips. It took us nearly an hour to ascend 4 stories, but we made it. The repeater tower on the roof was still intact, a 60-foot lattice mast braced to the concrete with guy wires. Most local dispatch traffic had gone silent, but we found an emergency override channel and patched into the repeater's panel using Clara's rugged radio unit. I took the mic. "This is Civil Engineer Nick Halperin, Louisiana DOTD, currently inside the Burton containment zone. We have visual confirmation of infectious humanoid activity. Multiple infected. Town is submerged. Access routes compromised. Request immediate extraction or communication. Respond if able." We waited, a full minute, static. Then a reply. "Confirm identity. Confirm location. Are you infected?" Clara's eyes locked with mine. I replied, voice steady. "Repeat. Nick Halperin, badge 680. 4421. With me is Clara Dubois, medical personnel from Lake Charles Memorial. Negative on infection. We are on the roof of the Burton Municipal Center. Latitude 30.9926, longitude -93.2885. We have footage and data on the infection. Repeat, we have proof." There was another pause. Then, acknowledged. Hold position. Do not attempt to leave the zone. Extraction not currently authorized. Maintain silence and avoid visual contact. Acknowledge. I stared at the mic, stunned. What does that mean? Are you sending help? Repeat, do not leave the zone. Do not transmit further. Surveillance will continue. Extraction status pending. Stay quiet. Then the signal cut. Clara sat down heavily against the parapet. They're not coming. They're watching us like we're lab rats. It made sense, in a horrifying way. If the infection was waterborne or vector-driven, they'd want it contained, isolated. Study the spread without risking escape. But we weren't volunteers. We were survivors. We slept in shifts that night, posted behind the stairwell with the door wedged shut using an old fire extinguisher. The infected didn't climb. Not usually, but some of them were starting to change. Faster reflexes, closer coordination. Clara said she'd seen them moving in packs, flanking, cornering stray animals. It wasn't random. Something about it was learning. By morning, we'd made our decision. If the feds weren't coming, we were getting out ourselves. The drone footage would go with us on foot if we had to. The shortest route was east, across the submerged industrial park, then down into the old waterworks. If the tunnels were intact, we could follow them out of town, below the worst of the flood. It was a gamble, but we were out of options. The industrial park was a patchwork of corrugated steel warehouses and semi-trailer depots. Most were underwater to the mid-windows, but a few rooftop walkways gave us a partial path forward. We crossed slowly, pausing at each gap to check for movement. At one point, I spotted a group 5, maybe 6, standing ankle-deep in water near a collapsed loading bay. They didn't move like the others. They were still, heads tilted upward, as if listening to something we couldn't hear. One of them turned slowly and walked into the building without prompting. The others followed. "They're responding to something," Clara whispered. "But it's not us." Reaching the waterworks took the better part of the day. The entrance was through an old inspection stairwell behind a row of generator sheds. We used bolt cutters to snap the rusted chain on the hatch and descended into a passage of concrete and steel. The air was thick and damp, but for the first time in days, we were out of the rain. Inside, the service tunnels stretched for miles, a lattice of maintenance shafts, old pump corridors, and stormwater overflow channels built decades ago and half forgotten. We used chalk to mark our turns and kept to the red-striped conduits, which, according to the facility maps, connected to the old South Sluice, outside town limits. It was dry in parts, damp in others, but navigable. It was also not empty. We first heard it while passing through an old junction chamber, a soft, rhythmic scraping. At first I thought it was rats. Then I saw the drag marks, long, wet smears against the walls, like something had been crawling. Clara raised her shotgun, and I drew the pry bar I'd carried since my truck. We pressed forward, keeping our lights low and steps deliberate. We passed a half-submerged locker room and an electrical panel blown from some surge. Then we found a man, or what was left of him, pinned to the ceiling by what looked like steel rebar, driven clean through his torso. He wasn't fresh, but he also hadn't been there more than a day. There were scratch marks all around him, not from him, from something else. We pressed on. Hours passed underground. Our lights were dying and our water was low. Then we reached the sluice gate. It was half open enough to crawl through. Beyond it was a spillway that led downhill toward the Atchafalaya Basin. If we could get that far, we'd be outside the quarantine perimeter. But as we climbed through, we heard the echo again, not behind us. Ahead, a rasping, wet breath. Then footsteps, fast ones. We backed up quickly into the chamber, but the tunnel was narrow and the sluice too tight for both of us to go back at once. I shoved Clara through. She screamed something I didn't catch. Then the shape lunged from the dark. It wasn't like the others. This one moved like a predator low to the ground, arms bent like a sprinter, eyes wide and lidless. Its jaw hung unnaturally far open. It shrieked as it lunged for me. I swung the pry bar hard. It connected with bone. The thing crumpled, but not fully. It writhed on the ground, clawing toward me. I hit it again and again until it stopped moving. Clara pulled me out through the sluice and we collapsed on the grass beyond. The air smelled of pine and wet soil. For the first time in a week, we were on dry land. But we weren't safe, not yet. The sun had begun to set, casting a warm orange glow over the flooded pine flats. From where we lay, the forest sloped gently down toward the basin, the remnants of old logging roads just visible beneath layers of runoff and debris. We were outside the official town limits now, at least 4 miles southeast of Burton's center, but the silence felt heavier than it should have. No insects, no frogs, just the slow trickle of water behind us and the occasional gust of wind through pine needles. We moved slowly at first. My ribs ached from the encounter in the tunnel, and Clara had twisted her ankle scrambling through the sluice. Still, we had no choice but to keep walking. We needed higher ground, somewhere defensible. There was a fire watchtower marked on the forestry maps about 2 clicks east, used by the US Forest Service, back when the region still received regular patrols. If it was still standing, we could use it to signal aircraft, recharge equipment, maybe even catch a glimpse of movement along the perimeter roads. Clara navigated using the same rugged tablet she'd used for drone control. The topo maps it stored were out of date, but still useful. We moved in silence, watching every shadow between the trees. More than once, we spotted broken branches at chest height, not deer trails, but something heavier, moving upright. At one point, we passed a shredded camping tarp half buried in the mud, its guy lines tangled with what looked like torn clothing. No blood, no body, just evidence of panic and a quick exit. We reached the tower near nightfall. It was still standing, a 40-foot, galvanized steel frame with wooden stairs spiraling up to a small observation hut. The lower steps were slick with moss, but intact. I climbed first, testing each board. At the top, the hut had broken windows but a solid frame. A long-dead VHF radio sat rusting on the console beside a weathered pair of binoculars. The emergency rations were gone, probably looted years ago, but the place was dry, and that was enough. From the top, I could see just how far the water had spread. The entire basin west of us had become an inland sea. Burton was no longer a town. It was an island of rooftops, slowly rotting in the summer heat. And worse, I saw signs of movement along the tree line. Not vehicles, not survivors, figures, barely distinguishable at this distance, but wrong in posture, off in gait. Not wildlife. That night, we took turns on watch. I used the last of our lithium power to copy the drone footage onto a spare SD card and lock it inside a waterproof case tied to my belt. If we died out here, at least one of us might still get that data out. Clara was quieter than usual. She sat cross-legged near the far window, a compact 9mm pistol in her lap and a tattered map unfolded beside her. I recognized the expression. She was doing math risk calculations, distance estimations, odds of survival. It was the same look I'd seen in engineers who knew a bridge wasn't going to hold, but couldn't say it out loud. I asked her what was bothering her. "They're spreading," she said after a moment. "Faster than they should. We've been cut off for less than 2 weeks. That kind of dispersal rate, it's not natural." She traced a line on the map with the tip of a pen. If the infection was only passed by contact bites, scratches, it would still be localized. But we've seen things moving in the water, heard things underground. That means other vectors. She looked up at me. "What if it's airborne?" I shook my head. "We've been exposed too long. If it was airborne, we'd be like them by now." She gave a weak shrug. "Unless it only activates under certain conditions. Fever, blood loss, some kind of hormonal trigger. Something latent, hiding in the system." I didn't want to think about that. Not now. In the morning, we spotted the first sign of containment measures beyond the quarantine zone. A string of white flags tied between pine trees, fluttering silently in the breeze. At first I thought they were trail markers, but they were too uniform, too deliberately spaced. Each bore a number stenciled in faded red ink. R-Zone 3-7, a biological hazard marker. Clara confirmed it with a glance. Response Zone 3, Sector 7, that's CDC protocol. We followed the flags until we reached what had once been a rural service road, now a churned up mess of tire tracks and scattered debris. military style, fresh, a week old at most. Beyond it, we saw the fence, a temporary barrier over 8 feet tall, made of stacked Hesco bastions and chain link topped with razor wire. It stretched through the forest in both directions, ending only where the terrain became too uneven to fortify. A perimeter, no guards, no gates, but cameras several mounted on high poles, sweeping slowly. "We're on the outside," Clara said flatly. "They built this after the breach." We couldn't climb it, not without tools, but a creek nearby had eroded the foundation beneath one section of the fence. With effort, we dug through the mud until we could slip underneath. It took an hour, and we tore our clothing doing it, but we got through. On the other side, the woods gave way to open farmland. Abandoned tractors rusted beside overgrown fields. A grain silo stood listing in the distance. No movement, no people. But here and there, we spotted more flags. White, then yellow, then orange. Each zone closer to the breach. We found shelter that night in an old ranch house near a dry gully. It had once belonged to someone meticulous, every cabinet labelled, every tool hung neatly on pegboard in the barn. There was still a shortwave receiver wired to a car battery on the kitchen table. Dusty, but functional. I tuned through the bands slowly, searching for any signal. And then I found one. A voice calm, measured, male speaking in cycles. "If you're hearing this, you're outside quarantine perimeter 5. You must report to Zone Alpha checkpoint. Do not approach civilian structures. Do not engage with unverified individuals. Repeat." It looped, no time code, no two-way. But now we knew there was something out here, an organized response, a base. We planned to move at first light, following the power lines that ran southeast toward the Sabine River. That's where the Zone Alpha checkpoint had to be, near the old emergency crossing into Texas. With luck, we could make it before our rations ran out. If not, we'd rely on whatever we could scavenge. But the next morning, the barn was open. We had closed it the night before, locked it even. Now the door hung slightly ajar, swaying gently in the breeze. Tracks shallow but distinct led from the tree line to the threshold. Not boots, not shoes. Bare feet, and not human-sized. Clara didn't say a word. She raised the shotgun and stepped back into the kitchen. I followed, hand on the pry bar, eyes scanning the fields. Nothing moved. Then the smell hit us. Rot, wet fur, stagnant water. It rolled in like a wave, choking and sour. A shape moved between the fence posts across the pasture, hunched, long-limbed, fast, too fast. It dropped to all fours as it ran, kicking up dust, then vanished into the creek bed. There were more now, hunting in silence. They'd followed us through the sluice, or they'd already spread this far. Either way, we couldn't stay. We packed everything we could carry and slipped into the forest at an angle not toward the checkpoint, not yet. First, we needed elevation. A ridgeline, a fire break, anywhere we could see the scope of what we were walking into. Clara marked a series of waypoints on the tablet. I kept watch with the binoculars. The woods were thick with undergrowth loblolly pines mixed with patches of red maple and water oak, their trunks soaked from weeks of storms. The higher we climbed, the more we saw signs of old management work, faded red trailblazes on trees, rusted culverts under footpaths, forgotten survey ribbons hanging limp from branches. Decades ago, this had been part of the Kisatchie National Forest boundary extension. Now, it was just no man's land, too wild for civilians, too close to the edge for containment teams to risk patrolling. We reached the ridgeline by late afternoon. The slope fell away beneath us into a wide flood basin, still partially submerged, but draining slowly into the southeast. Beyond it, I saw the glint of metal in the sun rows of white trailers, antenna towers, perimeter fencing. Not a town, but a forward operations base. Clara confirmed it on the map. Zone Alpha, roughly 10 miles away. But between us and it was something else, not just swamp, movement, clusters of it. Dozens, no, more moving, not at random, but as a wave. You could see the ripple through the trees, the way animals might stampede through brush. but without panic, without sound, controlled. Clara studied the patterns and murmured something I didn't quite catch. I asked her to repeat it. "They're not wandering," she said. "They're sweeping." We watched through the binoculars for almost an hour. What struck me wasn't their numbers. It was their spacing. Equal distances between individuals, staggered pacing, no obvious communication but still synchronized. They were searching, systematically, not just roaming. We pulled back behind the ridge, concealed by brush, and reviewed our options. A straight shot southeast was no longer viable. We'd be crossing directly into a moving grid of infected. We could loop north along the high ground and drop back into the basin near a narrow levee, or cut east through rougher terrain and risk the old log switchbacks. Either way would take more than a day, maybe 2. We chose the levee. It was exposed, but it gave us a visual corridor if things went wrong. At least we'd see them coming. That night, we made camp in a dry wash beneath a fallen hickory, using emergency blankets to mask our body heat and a chemical warming pad to avoid visible flames. We ate the last of our MRE's rehydrated pasta and a vacuum-packed fig bar, and shared a single canteen of filtered creek water. The silence in the forest wasn't peaceful. It was anticipatory, like everything around us was holding its breath. Around 3 a.m., I heard a distant sound, a kind of static crackle, like a bad radio transmission, but mechanical, repeating. A pulse. Clara heard it too. She reached for the receiver and scanned the shortwave bands, finally picking it up just above 30 megahertz. Delta Echo 9, negative visibility, no heat signatures on drone pass, movement confirmed east of burn zone, possible shift in containment perimeter, repeat, perimeter integrity compromised. We listened in silence. The message wasn't meant for us, but it confirmed what we feared. The zone was expanding, and they knew. By morning, we were moving again. The air was hot and humid, the kind of heavy heat that makes sweat cling to your back and every breath feel damp. We reached the levee before noon and found it just barely intact, a raised gravel path about 3 feet above the basin, lined with scattered debris and the rusted carcass of a flatbed truck that looked like it had been there for years. We crossed single file, weapons ready. Halfway across, Clara froze. I followed her gaze. About 200 meters ahead, something was crouched in the brush. At first, I thought it was an animal. Then it rose slowly, too tall, too narrow, arms too long. Its head turned sideways like it was listening, but it didn't see us. The wind was in our favor. We ducked behind the truck, stayed low for 10 minutes. It eventually moved on, shuffling across the levee into the marsh, vanishing into cattails. I noticed something strange about the way it walked. Not just limping, more like adjusting, correcting itself, as if it were trying to mimic balance. That level of coordination wasn't what we'd seen back in Burton. They were adapting, again. The last leg of the journey took us through a fallow orchard. The rows of pecan trees had overgrown, their lower branches hanging low and tangled with vines. It made for slow going, but gave us cover. Every few minutes we paused to listen, not for growls or screams, but for absence. No birds, no crickets. That was the warning sign. Clara stumbled on a tree root and caught herself against a trunk. She winced, and I saw her pull her sleeve back. Her forearm was bruised deep purple. "You didn't mention that before," I said quietly. "It's not from a bite," she snapped. "The tunnel, when we climbed out, I didn't push it, not then." By dusk, we reached the final rise before Zone Alpha. From the ridge, we saw the outer fence double-layered, chain link with motion detectors, reinforced by floodlights and towers spaced every 200 feet. Inside the perimeter was a small compound, prefab barracks, modular labs, a helipad, a water purification rig, and 4 armored vehicles parked in staggered formation. Soldiers moved between structures, armed in full NBC gear, not hazmat suits, but MOP level 4, gas masks and sealed gloves. They weren't relaxed. This wasn't a cleanup crew. It was a last line. We needed a signal, Something undeniable. Clara dug into her pack and pulled out the SD case, opened it, inserted the chip into her tablet, and booted the footage. I helped rig her drone antenna to boost the signal, aimed it directly at the nearest comms tower inside the base, and transmitted a burst packet with embedded metadata GPS coordinates, timestamps, and a looping feed of the drone's thermal footage from Burton. 10 minutes later, a siren blared from the compound. Searchlights swept the tree line, a loudspeaker activated. "Stay where you are, hands visible, do not approach." We stepped into the open, slowly, arms raised. 2 soldiers met us at the outer fence, weapons drawn but not raised. They scanned us with handheld thermal units, then activated a spray drone to mist us with antiseptic decontaminant. After that, we were brought through an airlock and stripped of every item we carried. Our names were taken, vitals checked, blood drawn. Then came the interviews, not by military, but civilian CDC specialists, epidemiologists, one man from the Department of Energy, which confused me until I saw the logo on his badge, Biological Threat Response Division. Clara did most of the talking. She explained what we'd seen, where we'd gone, how the infected behaved, and what had changed. She showed them the footage, the marked maps, the zone markers. They barely asked any questions. One of the specialists pulled me aside later, quietly, off record. "You weren't supposed to get out," he said. "We didn't think anyone could. That sluice system wasn't on any of our diagrams." I asked what they were doing here. Containment, quarantine. He just looked at me. Observation, until further notice. They held us for 3 days. Medically, we were clear. No fever, no markers in blood work. But we weren't allowed to leave the base. Not yet. Too many unknowns, they said. Then, on the 4th morning, Clara collapsed. She'd been pale the night before, said she felt tired. I assumed it was stress, but when I found her on the floor outside the bunk hall, eyes glassy, skin cold, I knew something was wrong. I shouted for help. Medics arrived in full gear. They moved fast. No discussion. She was taken to a sealed ward, and I was quarantined separately. I never saw her again. I asked, begged, threatened. No one answered. One night, a technician left a folder on my bunk. Inside were scanned notes, excerpts from Clara's field logs, medical annotations, behavioral models, progression timelines. She'd been tracking symptoms in herself. The bruising, the fatigue, auditory hallucinations she hadn't told me about. Her notes speculated on latency, the idea that certain individuals could harbor the infection without immediate transformation. Days, maybe longer. She had known, and still helped me get out. A week later, I was given a set of civilian clothes and driven under armed escort to a regional field office 3 hours north. From there, I was flown to Baton Rouge. I was told to stay quiet, that there would be no report, no media, no statement. Officially, Burton had been abandoned due to flood risk. The region was being converted into a restricted ecological preserve. All aerial access was grounded. The last thing they told me, "You were lucky, don't test it twice." But luck had nothing to do with it. Clara bought me time with her life, and what we saw out there, what we recorded, it wasn't just an outbreak. It was an evolution. And it's not over, not even close. Thanks for listening. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like and subscribe. Your support keeps these creepypastas coming. Until next time, stay alert, stay safe, and never ignore the feeling that something is watching.